We are Life Church Livonia.
Okay, Life Church Livonia, you can go ahead and find your seat. It is so good to be here with you this morning. My name is Brian. I'm the pastor here, and I'm grateful that we get to do life together. And as part of that life together, I want to introduce to you a team that we have been forming over the last few months and that we are kicking off today. And so I want to invite our prayer team to come on up to the front right now. You can join me on stage. I can't see you, but I know you're out there somewhere. And so I just want to give you a little bit of history about this. Our church, really at its core, is founded on prayer. We are about prayer. We are about growing personally through prayer. We're about helping you learn to have intimacy with God through prayer. And honestly, we want you to be in a beautiful, healthy relationship with God. And we know that there are times when you need assistance. People that come alongside of you, right? To pray over you and pray with you. And so we put together a team that is going to be doing that. And we want to commit to you that you're not alone. When we say real people, real God, real life, that means that we bring who we are, not who we pretend to be. And prayer time is a great opportunity to do that, to be vulnerable before God and vulnerable with people. And so we want to raise up a group of trustworthy leaders who can pray over you and with you every Sunday at the services. And so starting today, in the back corner of the room over here, where you can kind of see there's an opening, after the sermon and during the final worship songs, there will always be someone from this team there to pray with you. And so we wanted you to see who they were so that you would kind of recognize a face and it wouldn't be as intimidating. And I want to really encourage you that I'm going to take advantage of this. I'm going to go receive prayer, and I think that you should too, because it is where everything happens. But I think it's really important for us as a church to not just receive prayer from them, but I think that we should pray for them today. To pray for the prayer team. And so I want to do that right now. Dave Rodriguez is the head of that team. He is the one. First service, I said that part of prayer is stepping into the light of Jesus. And Dave, because we need him to step into the light. But this is why he's the perfect guy, the humble, faithful servant of the Lord. And I want you to know that Dave leads this team from his knees. Amen. So good. And so, yeah, you can fly. I'm excited, guys. This is worth clapping for. So I want to pray for them. Would you guys pray with me as I'm going to sneak around behind you guys, okay? Would you pray with me? Jesus, I just lift up this team to you. They have been called by you, equipped by you, and now they need to be empowered by you. So Jesus, we want everything we do and everything we say to honor and glorify you. Everything we do and everything we say to increase people's relationship with you. So I pray that the prayer team would do that. That you would fill them with your Holy Spirit, with all knowledge and wisdom and strength and power they need to live into the job that you've called them to. And Jesus, I pray that as they minister over us and with us every Sunday morning, that you would do miraculous things in our midst. Increase our faith. Increase our confidence and trust in you, Lord, as we come before your throne. And so, Jesus, I just commit each member of this team to you in your name and through your power. And all God's people said, amen. All right, thanks, team. This Sunday, we need a railing for our stairs, don't we? All right? Or a slide. That's the kind of church we are, people. I'm jealous of Kensington Church. I know jealousy isn't supposed to be something pastors are supposed to experience, but I'm human. Because Kensington has a slide from their second story down to their, and it's supposed to be for the kids, but every time I go there, I go down the slide. So I just want to confess, that's who your pastor is. And so, hey, so I'm also excited not only about our prayer team, but about our new series that's starting today. It's called Surviving Family. And we know that for many of you, the holiday season is really exciting. And it's exciting for you primarily because you get to spend so much time with your family, right? This is why the holidays that's why so many of you look forward to the holidays. But it's also conversely the reason why so many of you dread the holidays. It's because of your family. It's why for some of you, the holidays are a really brutally difficult time for you because you're missing family. because you feel removed from them, because maybe someone passed away and you can't imagine doing holidays without them. If family is important and it's difficult. And we want to figure out how to do it well. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to be leaning into God's word to hopefully give you some biblical foundations upon which you can build your relationship with God and also your relationship with people, especially the people in your family. These things we're going to be talking about, they affect every relationship you're going to have. But especially during this season, my hope is that your family would not only survive the season, but your family would thrive in the midst of the season. You would come out of 2018 and the holiday season of 2018 with beautiful stories to share about what God has done in you and through you. And so what I'm not going to do in this series is tell you how to fix your family. That's not our job. What I'm going to be teaching during this series is how to take a look at yourself and to say, well, God, let it begin with me. As much as it depends on me, Lord, my prayer is that I would do my part to have a healthy, thriving family that flourishes in the way that God designed us to flourish. That's my hope for you. And I think that there are a bunch of key things that we could learn as we go about that. We could spend 12 weeks on this. We could spend the entire year on this and probably not cover everything you need to know. But we want to cover a few really key things that I think are principles that if you apply them to your life, that things will change. They'll begin to change over time as you are changed and as the people around you notice those changes and they adopt them in their own life. And so this morning, where I want to start is this. The very first thing, the very first key ingredient to a healthy, thriving family is that we need boundaries. We need boundaries. You need boundaries. I need boundaries in my life. If I'm ever going to live into a healthy, thriving family. We're talking about personal boundaries that identify who I am. And so what I want to make clear for you is that a boundary is like a property line. A boundary is a property line where it helps you identify this is where I begin and where I end. And this is where you begin and where you end. It helps unblur the lines between people and between family members. It's critical that we do this because you can't be in healthy community with people. You cannot be in healthy relationships with people unless you're healthy. We need boundaries in our life. A boundary is simply the line that defines kind of this is how I feel, this is what I value, this is what I need. Here's my wants, here's my desires, here's my responsibilities, and this is my property. That is not my property. This is my life. This is my responsibility. That is not my life. That is not my responsibility. Boundaries are a property line for your life. And good boundary lines, good delineation in terms of who you are and what you're about, it helps make for healthy relationships. They're absolutely crucial. So we're going to spend all of next week talking about who you are in the middle of that. But today we want to talk about why do we need to draw the lines in the first place? Why is it so important that we can clearly define ourselves where we end and other people begin? And I think that my hope is at the end of this sermon, you would understand that you desperately need these in your life. And that not only do you need them, but your family and your community needs them from you and from each other. And for some people, you might be asking yourself the question, well, what does this have to do with being a Christian? I came to church not to hear some pop psychology or some latest trend. That's not what this is at all. Because this is actually at the core of what it means to follow God. Boundaries, as an essential part of what it means to be human, and especially as an essential part of what it means to be human in the context of community, are all over the Bible. From cover to cover, you find God being a God who says boundaries are essential. We worship a God who has been setting boundaries since the beginning of humankind. Boundaries for himself, limiting himself in his engagement with us in certain ways to give us more freedom. and boundaries on us. Since the beginning of humankind, our God has been a God of boundaries. All we have to do is even go to the beginning of the Bible. We go to the book of Genesis, and we see God defining who we are. He says, these are your roles. This is what you were made for. Defining what happens inside those boundaries, and then setting up guidelines for how we live. And coming to the first people that he interacted with and saying, this is what you need to do and what you need to not do in order to flourish, in order to live within my blessing, in order to not experience the pain that comes from living a boundaryless life. From the very beginning, God made it clear. You have to have boundaries, and if you break them, you will experience pain, and we have. From the very beginning, God said, boundaries are important because I love you, because I want you to flourish. And since that time, we've been like, I don't like boundaries. I don't like anyone to tell me what to do. I don't like the constriction that comes with that. I don't like the lack of freedom that comes with that. And so instead of experiencing the flourishing that God designed us for, we've been experiencing pain over and over and over again. All throughout the Old Testament, we see it. We see it in God's interactions with the Israelites and the way that he called them to be certain things and to not do certain things. He drew geographical boundaries for them. He drew relational boundaries for them, emotional boundaries, spiritual boundaries. Our God is a God of boundaries because our God is a God of love. He loves you. And that's why he sets boundaries. In the same way that if you have children over and over again, when they are upset because you've set a boundary or a rule for them and they say, why? And I tell my children over and over again, it's because I love you. The reason that daddy sets that boundary for you is because I love you. And that's the same thing with regards to our God. We see it in both the Old and New Testament. God saying, I want you to flourish. I want you to thrive. I want you to experience my blessing. I don't want you to experience unnecessary pain, because that's what you find when you step outside of the boundaries. But it's not just an Old Testament story. It's not just an Old Testament thread. Even Jesus, he modeled for us what it looks like to have boundaries. So we can just look at the life of Jesus and see what it looks like to have them. He had boundaries with regards to some private time, some personal time. He would regularly say to people that wanted to be with him, because honestly, Jesus was amazing. Everyone wanted to be with him all the time. And so he's like, no, I need some me time, some healthy, beautiful me time to disengage and to be alone, to be quiet, to pray, so that I can then re-engage in a healthy, beautiful way. He had a boundary there. He took time away from people, and we need to do the same thing. He was really firm in regard to where he was called to go and when he was called to go there. Jesus was really good at this. Many times people would want him to go and do things or be with people that he wasn't ready to do yet because it wasn't part of his mission in that moment. And he would just say, no, I'm not going to go, because he had boundaries in his life. We see him staying within those boundaries, and we also see him kind of pushing against the boundary lines that pre-existed him. Let me explain what I mean by that. We are all born into pre-existing boundaries that we didn't create, nor are we responsible for. You have them because you grew up in a certain culture. Maybe it was maybe you grew up here in Michigan and you have certain things that people do in Michigan. Or maybe you grew up in a foreign country and you've come in here and our boundary lines relationally are different than yours. And so you begin to see that our boundaries some of them are pre-existing. We know that boundaries are created for you by your family of origin. Things that they teach you are okay and things that aren't okay. There's boundaries that you've been given as a result of living in the United States. We call them laws. And we have to decide whether or not we're going to live within those boundaries or live outside of them. And so for Jesus, he looked at the pre-existing boundaries that were all around him, that came in the context of being a Jewish young man in an enslaved culture, honestly. They were a conquered civilization. The Roman Empire had come in and imposed their own new boundaries on top of Israel. And now the Jewish people are like, how do we live as a people of God underneath these new boundaries and these new rules, these new laws, and these new leaders? And so they began to draw stricter and stricter boundaries around their life. And Jesus looked at some of those and he said, no, listen, you drew those in the wrong place, especially when it came to loving people. Especially when it came to loving people, Jesus was willing to move the boundaries. And for some of you, the boundaries that your family has helped you draw since you were little, they're drawn in the wrong place. So Jesus modeled for us. He said, this is what it looks like to start erasing those lines and of moving them into alignment with God's heart and God's values for you. This is a big deal. Jesus was able to have such clear boundaries for his life because he knew who he was. He had a really clear sense of his identity, and he had a really clear sense of his mission. And you and I need that as well. A really clear sense of who we are. Boundaries help us to become self-aware, because as we do a survey of our life, when we begin to set up those borders, we begin to actually understand more deeply who we are. And I love this. If you want to go deeper and a deeper dive on this, there's an amazing book called Boundaries. It's written by Dr. Cloud and Townsend. And I can't teach this without some of their teaching flowing out of me, because it's become internalized over time. And so we're going to make mention of that book again at the end. If you want to dive deeper into what it looks like to become more self-aware, what it looks like to actually really establish boundaries, that book is incredible. But what I want you to know is this, is that boundaries give us a stable platform from which we can love God and love people. Not only do they make us self-aware, not only do they help us to say what we should and shouldn't do, they give us a stable platform from which we can love God and love people. This is critical. We have to have this platform, because boundaries aren't just about you. They're not just about what you do and what you don't do. Boundaries are about you living in the context of community. They're about you living in the context of your family of origin, or your family, your extended family that you're going to spend the holidays with. Boundaries are not just about you. They're about you living in community. So if we're going to create these kind of God-honoring, relationally building boundaries, I think we need at least three things. And I want to walk you through those this morning. And those three things that we need, if we're going to create a stable platform from which we can love God and love people, we need grace, we need truth, and we need love. Grace, truth, and love are essential. And these three things are all over the New Testament. As God trains us up of how to be a people that live in the context of community. And so multiple times in the different letters that the early church leaders wrote to the kind of brand new churches, over and over again, they address what it looks like to live in community and to do community well, to do community in a healthy way. And family is simply a community you didn't choose, right? Family is a community you didn't choose. And so how do we live in the context of community? God's word is really clear. So I want to jump into 1 Peter. Chapter 4. And this is Peter writing to a church and saying, hey, this is how you do community well. He says, in the midst of that community, each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various form. And you're like, what does that have to do with boundaries? And first of all, it has everything to do with boundaries, because boundaries are not designed to be selfish. He says, you should use whatever gifts you've received to serve others. God gives us everything we have for our own benefit and for the benefit of our community, for the benefit of your family. And as we begin to understand who we are, just like Jesus knew who he was, our call is to be faithful stewards of the gift of God's grace, all the gifts that God has given us. Boundaries aren't designed to be selfish. Boundaries help you love God and love people. They're about us becoming stewards. What does it mean to be a steward? This is not a word we use very often, right? We are a really good steward of something when we manage the resource we've been given and trusted with effectively. Let me give you an example. If I was your financial manager and you entrusted your money to me, you would expect me to be a good steward of your finances, right? That I would take the resources you've entrusted me, your money, your savings, and I would be a good steward of it. When you come here, if you have children and you come to Life Church Livonia and drop your children off at Life Kids, you expect us to be a good steward of that trust, right? Of the trust in your kids. We take that really seriously. That's why we have a mission control where you check your children in. It's why we take security seriously. It's why all the back doors of the church are locked. It's why we vet all of our volunteers and we run them through a background check, because we want to be a good steward of your precious child that you've entrusted to us. When we're talking about boundaries, when we're talking about stewardship in that kind of context, what we're talking about is you are the resource. your life, your gifts, your abilities, your relationships. Those are the things that God is saying, I want you to be a good steward of them so that you can love God and love people, so that you can be faithful, so that you can be fruitful, so that you can thrive, so that you can experience my blessing and not unnecessary pain. And in order to do that well, in order to steward the resource that you've been entrusted with, you have to be firmly rooted in the grace of God. What are we stewards of in 1 Peter? God's grace. We receive grace and we give grace. Our boundaries must have grace as one of the pillars, or else our boundaries will not be effective. And this is so true. Listen closely here. Boundaries without grace become legalistic barriers to healthy relationships. And they prevent us from living into the community that we were designed for. Boundaries without grace, we have to have grace in our boundaries. Just as this passage is talking about being faithful stewards of God's grace, we have to have grace in our boundaries. Otherwise, we no longer are able to have relationship with other people. We're no longer able to actually engage other people. This is huge, and you know that this is true if you've ever interacted with people who have legalistic boundaries in their life that are graceless. Or maybe you're that person. This is an opportunity for us to change, for us to turn from this legalistic, graceless kind of boundary that we've established in our life and to step into the kind of life that God has designed us for in the context of community. Legalism is not what we're about. Our boundaries must have grace, but they also require truth. They also require love. In a letter that Paul wrote later to the Ephesians, he talks about what it looks like for us to kind of do what Peter's talking about here about using our gifts. He goes into more detail. He says, okay, let's name those gifts. Let's name the gifts that exist within personal boundaries, the you. Let's name what I've entrusted to you, what you're called to be stewards of. And he begins to walk through the different kind of gifts that the church has been given and entrusted with. And he says, listen, if you live into that, if the church lives into that, if we live into that in the context of our families, guess what's going to happen? You're going to thrive. And he describes what will happen in Ephesians chapter 4, 14 through 15, if we figure out who we are and we live into it. He says this: we will no longer be like infants, tossed back and forth by the waves, and blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and by the cunning and craftiness of people and their deceitful scheming. Let me make this really clear for you. The author of this letter is picking the most helpless thing you can possibly imagine, an infant. An infant doesn't choose boundaries for themselves, right? We set those boundaries. And so he's saying, if you don't figure out who you are, if you don't draw the lines around your life and allow God to teach you how to live in the midst of those boundaries, and if you don't then figure that out and live it in the context of community, all of you will be like infants tossed back and forth by the waves of life. No control over what's happening. No control over what's next. No control over who you are and the impact you have in your community. You will be like infants, tossed back and forth by waves. So what do we do instead? He goes on and he says this: instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow in every respect into the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. This is critical. He's saying, listen, not only do you need grace, you need truth. And you need truth that's rooted in love. And if you do this, boundary, life, values, mission, purpose, we're going to talk about that all next week. If you do that, guess what's going to happen? You're going to mature not only as an individual, but you're going to mature as a community. You're going to mature as a family unit. What this means is that if we actually live into who God made us to be and we change, our family will change. This isn't about changing the people around you. It's about allowing God to change you and identifying who you are at and doing that in the context of truth and love. So let's get real for a minute. Let's talk about some of the waves. This verse is talking about that we'll be like infants tossed back and forth by waves. So what are some of the waves that you'll experience in your life? in your season here in the holiday season. And think about the people that try to influence your boundaries, that try to push your boundaries or draw you out from inside of the boundaries or in kind of step inside your personal life. Think about people like the mother-in-law who's always making comments. Okay, some of you have that mother-in-law. If she's sitting next to you, I don't encourage you to nudge her. That's not wise. Won't work out well for you. But think about the mother-in-law. The mother-in-law that you've established your boundaries for yourself personally. You've established your boundaries for your kids, for your marriage. And sometimes our extended family comes in and they're like, well, you should be doing it this way. And they want to redraw your boundary lines. It's a wave. It's a wave that tries to push us out of the space that we're called to be in. What about that brother or that sister or that nephew or that niece or that cousin who has really strong opinions about the way life should be done? And they're constantly pushing you to be something that you know you're not called to be. It's a wave that if you're not rooted in truth, you will get pushed off course. What about the friend or the family member that is the never-ending fountain of need? Do you know these people? I need, help me. The person whose life is perpetually in crisis. They are like a wave that if you are not careful will sweep you away from your stable foundation. The stable foundation that you've created so that you can love God and love people, you won't even be able to love God. And you won't be able to love people well because this person who's a perpetual font of need will sweep you off your moorings. These are the kind of waves that will sink you and will sink your family. It's critical that we address this because we need the truth of God. It's essential. And this is what I want to make a note of something really important here, is that we've all experienced those waves. Pain, some of us more than others. Some of us know what it's like to feel like an infant tossed back and forth in the waves of life. No control, nothing but heartache. Most of those experiences, I'm having a hard time even coming up with an experience that's painful that this doesn't apply to. Most of those experiences you've had are a result of either you or someone you know living outside of their boundaries. Think about that. Think about the people that hurt you. They lived outside of the boundaries. Think about the way you've hurt people. You were living outside of your boundaries. The guidelines, the ethos of what it means to be a healthy, thriving person. We experience pain, and then sometimes what happens is we redraw our boundary lines based on that pain. Not based on grace or truth or love, but based on pain. And honestly, boundaries that are defined by our pain are almost never healthy boundaries. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have boundaries in those areas. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do a survey of your life and say, well, what caused that pain? Was it other people's lack of boundaries or was it mine? You have to look at those things, but then you need to process them through grace and truth and love. This is absolutely critical because boundaries, if they don't have grace, they become legalism. And if they don't have truth, they become negotiable. They become negotiable. And other people can come in and tell you what your boundaries should be. But at the core of it all, they have to have love. They have to have love. Jesus was really clear about this. That love has to be the number one motivation, the number one goal when setting up boundaries. It has to be love. And we see this truth reflected in Jesus' words in John 13. He says, a new command I give you. Love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. This is Jesus. And this is the interesting question that I want to ask you today. Jesus says, a new command I give you. Did Jesus tell them something? Did love just come into existence in that moment? Did love predate Jesus? Did love predate this moment in his ministry when he looks at them and says, a new command I give you? How could it be possible that after centuries of relationship with God, Jesus could look at his Jewish counterparts and say, I'm going to give you a new command. Love. Love one another Was it really new? Or was it just something that they'd forgotten? Was it something that had gotten lost in the midst of them trying to live into really strict boundaries? I think they lost it. And the reason Jesus had to give them a new command is because they were missing the point. Their boundaries were not rooted and established in love. It wasn't their number one motivation any longer. They'd experienced the love of God, but they now weren't allowing the love of God to flow through them out to their community. So they had these legalistic, graceless, truth-based, but boundaries devoid of love. Jesus says, you have to have love or else you have nothing. You have to have love or you have nothing. So let me ask you a question. Some of you are sitting here today and you're thinking to yourself, I think I'm pretty good. I have strong boundaries. I'm a person that's really clearly defined, my life, my role, what I do, what I don't do. I'm good at saying, all the right things and doing all the right things. And I want to ask you a question. Just take a moment. If you were going to figure out your property lines at your house, you would call in a surveyor, right? Well, I want you to allow God, I want you to allow your conscience to be the surveyor right now of your own boundaries, to look at the lines you've drawn and ask yourself these questions. Do my boundaries demonstrate to other people my love for God? Do my boundaries demonstrate my love to my spouse? Do my boundaries demonstrate my love and God's love to my children, to my friends, to my neighbors? If the answer to those questions is no, then we need to redraw our boundaries. Ask yourself this question, the next. Are my boundaries rooted in truth? Or are they negotiable? Are my boundaries something that can change based upon season and based on circumstance? Or are they rooted in truth so that they aren't easily shaken? And finally, ask yourself the question, do my boundaries allow me to be an extension of God's grace to other people? Or are my boundaries graceless? This is critical for you, even if you aren't a follower of Jesus. Even if you're just showing up to church today as a visitor and you're checking it out and you're wondering what it looks like to be a part of the Christian faith, if you can figure out how to make boundaries rooted in grace, truth, and love, you will have not only a healthier life for yourself, but you will have healthier relationships with other people. It's absolutely critical. So I want to get really specific for a minute. I want to get really clear for some of you who struggle with this. Because I know that there's people in this room who really wrestle with boundaries. You set them, but you don't keep them. I can see you right now. You set them, but you don't keep them. So I want to give you a really important kind of phrase that you can memorize that will help you in this area. Are you guys ready for some really practical learning? So in a few moments, I'm going to put a phrase up on the screen that if you can learn this one phrase, you will do a much better job of living into the boundaries. Boundaries that are filled with grace, truth, and love. All right, here it is. This is the phrase. Okay, we're going to practice. Are you ready? For some of you, this isn't a word that comes out of your mouth very often, so I thought maybe if we practice this morning, it would help you. So are you ready? We're going to say it together. The phrase is no. Let's say it again. No. We have to be able to say no, or else our boundaries are useless. We have to be able to say no to ourselves. No, Brian, you should not do that because that's outside of the boundaries that God has set for you. You're venturing into territory, Brian, that is not healthy for you or healthy for other people. I have to be willing to say no to myself, and we have to be willing to say no to the people around us. It's critical. And people are going to push back. They're going to push back hard. If you've never had boundaries in your life and you start saying no for the first time, people are going to be like, who are you? And what did you do with my friend that had no spine? It's true. Another phrase you could add onto that Dr. Cloud and Townsend talk about a lot is they say, once you say no, if they push back and they say, why wouldn't you do that? You say, well, that doesn't work for me. I've set up boundaries for my life and that doesn't work for me. It sounds really simple, doesn't it, when we practice it together in church, but then when you actually go into real life and you engage real people, you're like, okay, this is much harder. You have to be firmly established in God, and we're going to talk about that all next week. The property lines in your life have to be drawn. But it doesn't mean that we don't care about people. It doesn't mean that we say no to everyone. Because not only do we have to figure out when it's appropriate to say no, we also have to figure out when it's appropriate to say yes. Because otherwise we live outside of the context of the community, and that's not the way God designed us. And I love what Galatians chapter 6 says about this. It really helps us understand when it's okay to say yes and when it's not okay to say yes at all. And so Galatians chapter 6, we're going to look at verse 2 and verse 5. And they say this: carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. And then in verse 5 it says, each one should carry their own load. And when you first read this, you're like, well, those seem to contradict each other. Like, this is why boundaries are hard for me, Brian, because it's confusing. Like, oh, am I supposed to carry other people's burdens, or am I supposed to carry my own load? Is that their responsibility, or is it my responsibility? The answer is found in the original language. As we dig into the Greek, this was originally written, and as we look at two words, we have to look at the word burden, and we have to look at the word load. What is it that we're talking about here? How do we determine when it's okay and appropriate and right and beautiful and fulfilling the law of Christ to carry someone's burden? And when do we have to carry our own load? That word burden, it has the meaning of something that's extremely heavy. Not something that you can easily pick up on your own, or honestly, it might be something that you just can't pick up at all by yourself. I helped my wife's company that she works for. They moved from one office to another yesterday, and we helped them move. And so I was picking up and putting things down all day long. And there were a couple of times when I went to pick something up that was way too heavy for me. One time in particular, there was a huge shelving unit that it was raised up on a platform in the truck, and I thought, oh, it's the perfect height for me to stick my arms under and grab it. And I start carrying this giant thing in, and I get about 10 steps, and I'm like, this maybe isn't very smart. This is bigger than what I should be carrying alone. And yet I didn't put it down, right? Because I was committed. I was going to make it. It was like a matter of pride. 3 people asked me on the way in if I wanted help. What did I say? No, because I had poor boundaries, okay? And so then I get inside, and I'm standing there in the middle of this new office space, surrounded by people who I just turned down their help from, and I'm realizing I have no idea how I'm going to put this thing down. I'd picked it up off of something elevated, and now I couldn't put it down. I was carrying a burden that I could not carry on my own, and that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. I had to call out for help. My wife and her partner had to come and rescue me from this burden that I was trying to carry on my own. When Galatians chapter 6, verse 2 says, carry each other's burdens, we're talking about things that you cannot and should not carry on your own. That's when we say yes. We respond to the unbearable burdens of the people around us, and we make that load bearable. We say yes. But each of us has a load, smaller, personal cargo that is ours to carry, ours to respond to. Think of it like a backpack that you wear. All the things you need to do life and to do life well and to serve the community you live in are contained in that backpack, and that's your job to carry. We can help you define it. We can help you adjust the straps. But if I spend all my time carrying your personal knapsack, I'm not doing you a favor, and I'm breaking a boundary between us. This is really critical. It's really critical that we figure out the difference between a burden that we're supposed to help someone carry and a load that is ours alone to carry. I love what Dr. Clouden Townsend say about this. He says, problems arise when people act as if they're boulders, because they call those extremely heavy burdens boulders. He says, problems arise when people act as if their boulders are daily loads and refuse help, or as if their daily loads are boulders they shouldn't have to carry. The results of these two instances are either perpetual pain or irresponsibility. Let me make this really clear. Some of us, the personal knapsack, the personal load, we act as if they're boulders that we can't carry, and we expect everyone else to carry them for us. That's called irresponsible behavior. And for others, we have these huge boulders, we have these huge burdens in our life that we won't let anyone help us with, and so we live in perpetual pain. Sometimes your boundaries have been set up as a result of your struggles, as a result of the waves in your life, and you've developed such strict boundaries that no one can help you, even if they wanted to. So you're shouldering burdens that you cannot carry alone. After I had that experience with that piece of furniture yesterday that I shouldn't have carried by myself, I came to another piece that was dramatically bigger than that, and I didn't even try. It took 4 of us to carry this thing in. But I had to be willing to ask for help. I could have tried to figure out a dolly system and try to rig it, but I would have hurt myself and probably hurt the people around me. We have to allow people to help us if they're ever going to carry our burdens, and that is part of the boundary making that has to occur in your life. So I want to summarize what my hope for you today is, because this is a lot of info, and honestly, it would take me weeks of preaching to walk you step by step through what it looks like to have good boundaries. And if you want to dive deeper into this, that book that I've mentioned like 5 times in my sermon, Boundaries, by Dr. Cloud and Townsend, is amazing. I've read it numerous times. It's begun to define me as a leader and as a man of God, as a husband and as a dad. 4 things I want to make clear to you. The first is this, is that I long for you to spend the time necessary to take a survey of your life. Take the time. Get before God. Get before your closest people and say, help me to see the boundaries. It's going to be work, but it's going to be work that is worth it. And then once you start drawing those new lines or adjusting the ones you have, my prayer is that those new lines will be rooted in grace and truth and in love. And then after you've established those boundaries, my hope for you is that you would learn to say no. That you would learn to say no to the people in your life that are emotional vampires, relational vampires just sucking off of you all the time. You say no to the waves in your life that try to push you off course and push you off your foundation, that you would learn to say no. And that finally, that you would learn to distinguish between burdens and loads. What's your responsibility and what is someone else's load? What is something that you need to help someone with, what you need to receive help for, what you can't carry on your own. We have to do this. It's critical. And that ultimately this holiday season, that as you take one baby step, because friends, baby steps are better than no steps. For some of you who are so overwhelmed by this, you're like, I don't even know where to begin. Well, begin in one relationship. Begin in one circumstance. Think it right now in your mind about the person in your family circle or in your friend group that you need to have better boundaries with. Think of that one person right now. And what I encourage you to do is in the time we're going to take after the message, during the worship time, then the prayer time, is just spend that time asking the Lord, what's one step I can take to redraw a boundary line in an appropriate way or to stand firm in a boundary I've already set? Baby steps, friends. Allow God to redraw your lines. And I believe that the best place to start in that is prayer. So I encourage you. Go for prayer during the songs. I'm going to go. I'm going to be first in line today. And I just encourage you to go as well. Because we need each other. We were designed to live in the context of community. Would you pray with me? Jesus, this is hard. We've been wrestling with boundaries since the beginning of time, and we will wrestle with them until the end of all things. We need your help. Jesus, thank you for modeling what it means to be people of boundaries, what it looks like to be people that live into grace and truth and love. And Jesus, right now, there are people in this room whose boundaries are too strict, whose boundaries have become a barrier between themselves and other people. And God, for that, we repent. Forgive us for the ways that we have had boundaries that are not helpful for relationship and not helpful for our own personal thriving, God. We confess that to you right now. And for others in this room, God, they've been a people that have no boundaries. And we've experienced the pain that comes from that. The heartache that comes from ourselves and other people regularly and routinely stepping over the lines. God, we ask that you would heal us. And for all of us, God, we commit ourselves to you. That you would be at the center of this process, forgiving us, healing us, correcting us, leading us, guiding us. God, we commit our hearts, our lives to you. We need you if we're going to do this well, because we want to be in the context of families that thrive. We love you. We commit this time, this worship to you in the name of Jesus.